Hi everyone, welcome to This Week in Impact, where ImpactAlpha editors discuss some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh. It's Thursday, August 8th. Today I'm joined by ImpactAlpha's editor, David Bank. We'll discuss why certain venture capitalists are embracing Kamala Harris's campaign vision, how 3 African blended finance models are mobilizing billions for development, and why microfinance pioneer Muhammad Yunus is stepping in to lead Bangladesh during a political crisis. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Welcome, David. ImpactAlpha has been back and hitting on all cylinders after last week's summer break. How are you doing?
Thanks, Brian. We're doing great. Yeah, the break helped us recharge our batteries, and we're back and raring to go.
And a lot to discuss, starting with from the windows to the walls. On the heels of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's joining the Democratic ticket, more than 4,000 venture capitalists and tech founders joined a VCs for Kamala video call yesterday to make the case that, in the words of LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman, quote, Kamala Harris is actually, in fact, the business candidate. So, David, Kamala began her political career in the heart of Silicon Valley as district attorney for San Francisco, and she's long been a part of the progressive political world that is California. But what do you make of yesterday's call and her VC backers?
Well, at some level, it was just an attempt by the VCs to jump in on all these calls that have been happening since the news that she was going to be the candidate. So there was black women, and then there was white women, and then there was even white dudes for Harris and many other calls as well. So this was the VC's turn at the plate. But in a broader sense, it was an attempt to reset the narrative. A few weeks ago, there was a flurry of attention to some of the big VCs backing Trump. So you had Mark Andreessen, obviously Elon Musk, but other folks too, David Sachs and Peter Thiel, and they were trying to make the case that Trump had become the innovation or the entrepreneurship tech candidate. That was itself a departure from kind of the canonical VC or Silicon Valley take of the last few decades. And while that obviously has signaled some kind of shift, I think that folks thought that the mainstream VC, as it were, and even the upcoming and emergent VCs really had much broader agenda than just what crypto regulation might be coming down the pike. Really, that a more holistic view of what the economy really needs is actually really what's the pro-business agenda. So you want inclusive prosperity. You want people's wages going up. You want people able to buy things. You want all kinds of founders to be able to get access to capital to start all kinds of businesses. So yesterday's call was kind of a return to that kind of agenda that situates tech and venture capital in a broader kind of economic model that works for all, as they say.
And so this works for all economic model, though, and how does that contrast with what the other VCs who are backing Trump, what are they trying to advocate for?
Well, famously, Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz said when they were endorsing Trump that they were basically making their decision really based on their own portfolio performance, that they had artificial intelligence and crypto investments, and that he was going to be better for that. Now, leaving aside whether he really would be better for all of that, yesterday's VCs were much more in the realm of the real economy, and there was some talk, regulations, always come in for a bad rap. But Stephen DeBerry from Bronze Investment pointed out that you need regulations to keep the system from collapsing in on itself, and that wealth can't just be aggregated into the very few. So kind of a notion that a better healthier economy, a bottom-up economy, inclusive prosperity is going to be better, not only for workers, not only for communities, but also for investors and businesses themselves.
So, David, of the VCs who were on the call, there were a number of impact VCs. What do you take of the impact VCs being a part of this movement?
Actually, that's a good point, Brian, because it kind of wasn't even called out, specifically, and it was sort of they're all part of a broader movement of backing founders and looking for new sectors and new ideas and the impact. We've always said that impact is the future of tech, impact is the future of finance, and it was sort of just integrated into the into the agenda and into the discussion. So I think maybe some of the kind of ideas that are kind of common in the impact world are now becoming more broadly accepted among all VCs, that the economic environment is crucial to the success of their businesses, and that a broader kind of prosperity, a kind of reduction of income inequality, those are good things for very cutting edge tech investors.
Now, meanwhile, David, everybody's been focused on the election, and rightly so, but the effects of this summer's Supreme Court decisions gutting the so-called administrative state are already playing out in legal challenges to rules on things ranging from climate action, labor rights, to corporate accountability, all things that impact investors care a lot about. Tell us about an upcoming call that we have to help impact investors map out that path forward in this new legal landscape.
Yeah, it's a little bit of counter programming that we're doing next week on our Agents of Impact call, because as you say, the elections will determine two branches of government, but this third branch, the judiciary, that's pretty well baked, at least at the Supreme Court level, for the time being. And so these decisions that came at the end of the term in June, there's one called Loper-Bright that people may have heard about already. It undid something called the Chevron deference doctrine, and what that basically said was that the courts should defer to the regulatory agencies when interpreting kind of complicated regulations, including a lot of environmental things and health and safety and labor rights. And so that the courts now are going to be able to be much more activist when it comes to those kinds of things. And so essentially in many cases, dozens of cases apparently, folks have already filed supplemental briefings saying that this or that regulation should be thrown out under this new doctrine. So even with good policies, courts and litigation risk may now become much bigger factor. And so what we're going to try to map out is, well, what can we do, or what can investors do in that context? And actually it turns out that kind of shareholder engagement and shareholder democracy is now going to become one of the true front lines of this, because the investors, you can say don't report on climate risks, but that doesn't make the climate risks go away. So investors actually still need to be concerned about that. So good old-fashioned things like materiality are going to be very much in play here, as investors say, well, I'm not necessarily beholden now to these government regulations, but I do want my company to do the right thing and to be ready for the future, and to be ready for climate risks. And I also want them to treat their workers better, because that creates a better better morale, better retention, all those things. And so the regulatory state may be withering, but the material risks remain.
All right. Well, that call again is on Wednesday, August 14th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, noon Eastern time, 5 p.m. in London. And check our show notes for a link to register for the call. We've already had several hundred people already sign up. So join those other Agents of Impact for our next Agents of Impact call. But let's take a quick break for now. When we come back, the financing innovations accelerating Africa's economic transformation. After 2 decades of continued economic growth in Africa, the lingering impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and recent global economic pressures have knocked the continent off track on almost all of its Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG targets. Meeting these SDGs in Africa by 2030 requires significant funding to the tune of over $1.3 trillion each and every year. That's 42% of the continent's entire GDP. As Akif Merchant of the nonprofit Convergence wrote this week for us in ImpactAlpha, those resources do exist in the global economy, but the current global financial architecture has not yet delivered them. What's needed is what's called blended finance, or catalytic capital, the billions in concessional capital needed to mobilize trillions in commercial capital. So, David, why is blended finance such an important tool to meet the ambitious SDGs?
Well, as you say, Brian, we're in the countdown to 2030 when the SDG goals were supposed to have been met. And, they're quite ambitious, end hunger, universal education, universal access to clean drinking water. So we're not on track for most, or if not all of those goals. And, it's going to take a massive deadline sprint to get there. And so the question, as you said, is how to raise the capital to do so. Blended finance is one of these kind of popular topics that has not quite achieved its potential over the years. We have now seen the emergence of much bigger deals. So we reported earlier on the SDG loan fund, which raised $1 billion from Allianz, mostly the big German insurance company, but it was backed up by various kinds of guarantees and risk mitigation from FMO, the Dutch Development Finance Institution, and the MacArthur Foundation, and that was kind of an example. Now we've got, as you said in the brief this week, three very wonky blended finance deals led by African institutions that are taking on different parts of the capital stack that have maybe been stuck or that have been obstacles to bringing in private finance. And as you said, there's plenty of private finance around in the world. They just haven't decided that they're going to be investing, for example, in water infrastructure in Africa. And so the question is, how can you bring those risks down so that development kind of projects become investor ready? And so, for example, Rwanda's development bank used some IDA funds, that's basic, foreign aid funds, but instead of just spending it, on a project, they used it to collateralize a $25 million currency bond. And so they reduced the risk for investors and the cost of borrowing for the bank and turned that $10 million into many times that. There's also very, as I said, wonky and complicated deals from places like the Eastern and Southern Africa Trade and Development Bank, and they floated up a kind of new class of shares that was able to backstop risk capital for climate action. And every dollar invested will leverage up to 4 times that in private capital. Similarly, the African Development Bank had these hybrid notes. And there's, as banks have a requirement for equity capital to be able to lend. And so this became a way to bring private capital in as equity that would allow them to diversify away from governments and be able to do more lending. So all of them are kind of tweaks or hacks, as it were, on the financial stack, basically making development finance investable for private commercial investors.
Now, David, all of these models really need to be replicated in order to get to the true scale that's needed. I mean, talking about moving from the billions to the trillions, and we've talked about blended finance before on the podcast. It's been something that ImpactAlpha has covered for many years. The organization Convergence does a great job of covering the space and providing technical assistance and promising examples of blended finance deals. But I think that it still is an idea whose time has not yet come into the true spotlight. It hasn't become mainstream as a concept, and I don't see too many of these deals replicating at the scale required or at the pace that's required. So what do you see that's holding back the kind of the faster adoption of blended finance?
Well, let's take the glass half full. I think what's different now is that the development finance institution, so these are kind of quasi-public banks or lenders. The U.S. one is called the Development Finance Corporation, and they are charged with helping, obviously do development finance, but they had operated more like commercial investors and less like catalytic investors. And so in recent years, from many quarters, there had been more pressure on these folks to play the role of catalytic investors and to be the first movers or the risk reducers and to bring in private capital. And I think the 3 examples I mentioned show that they're kind of embracing that new role. It's kind of new muscles for them. They've got to take on more risk themselves in some cases. They've got to sort of think more in terms of innovative financing mechanisms, change the sort of term sheets that they use. But they are the players that have the actual mandate to do development finance, and they have the wherewithal, they have the balance sheets. And now that they're sort of getting into the game with this blended finance mechanisms, there's hope that they could scale it. So yes, as you say, I think the amount of capital catalyzed in blended finance has kind of fallen short of what folks had thought. But now we kind of have new players on the field and maybe a chance to really ramp it up.
Now, the interesting piece about the 3 examples that you shared are these are all examples of African development organizations leading and structuring these deals, right? They are, of course, using some capital from outside of Africa, but these are African institutions developing that muscle to do and structure these deals. And what I think is what's needed is more standardization of these models. Once they've been developed, they need to become routine. And so going from a kind of a cutting edge, innovative new model to something that's vanilla. And vanilla is what would be attractive to outside commercial investors. They don't want the kind of shiny new object. They want to see something that's tried and true, and something that they can wrap their heads around, and see something that has a track record, so they feel safer deploying capital to these types of products and instruments.
Well, absolutely, on both points. On the first point, that it's local African financial institutions, African countries, African development finance institutions pioneering this, and that's been a broader trend of local capital for local needs. There's been a number of developments with African pension funds, investing more in Africa, and that's obviously a big source of capital. And then to your broader point about sort of replicability and sort of standardization, it is true that folks are looking for things that are familiar, but everything that's familiar, was novel at one point, including the 30-year mortgage, famously. So I think what's happening now is that we have the experimentation of these models, but really, as I said, none of the actual instruments are really that new. And what these kind of catalytic investors do is make the rest of the capital stack look much more like what institutional investors are used to, both in risk return profile and terms and everything else. So I think you can have both. You can have the innovation at the blending level, and then standardization and sort of plain vanilla, as you say, in the commercial parts of the stack.
All right, well, let's leave it there and take a quick break. When we come back, why the father of microfinance has been tapped to lead Bangladesh during a moment of political turmoil. A student-led protest movement in Bangladesh, a country of 170 million people, led to the resignation of its prime minister on August 5th. Now, David, a familiar name to those in the impact investing space was tapped to lead an interim government. That's Muhammad Yunus. Listeners may know him as the 84-year-old Nobel Peace Prize winning founder of the Grameen Bank, which pioneered the concepts of microcredit and microfinance. So, David, what do you make of Yunus's late-in-life pivot to politics?
Well, it's extraordinary on many levels. I mean, it wasn't many months ago that his offices were being raided of, I think, Grameen Telecom, and there were fraud and charges, and he was about to be brought up on trial. He almost went to jail at one point, and now he's essentially the prime minister, or the interim leader at least. And so at that level, it's a big turnaround for him personally, and the Grameen movement, which, as you say, is kind of credited with pioneering microfinance and a whole bunch of credit and finance innovations that have really taken off in the last few decades. So that's just sort of level one. Level two, I think, is the notion that that agenda, as it were, again, it's back to the bottom up, inclusive prosperity agenda, was what captured the imagination of the youths who were instrumental in bringing down Sheikh Hasina, the former prime minister, who fled, I think, into India in exile. And I think it showed, we've talked about the student protests in Kenya, and then they're breaking out in Nigeria and other places. Again, can this impact agenda, as it were, or this sort of notion of a sort of more inclusive, more sustainable economy, if that becomes a popular rallying cry, then and you got investors and student protesters on the same side of the equation, you've got a powerful coalition for change, not just in Bangladesh but in other countries as well.
In Dr. Yunus we trust, is what one of the student protest leaders said about the news of him.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the microfinance world, there have been some ups and downs over time, and it's obviously different than it was, in the very early days when it had a sort of cottage industry feel to it. It's now essentially the banking infrastructure in many countries. But it had a whole bunch of innovations that people take for granted now. I mean, it would lend to, small amounts, of course, but to women particularly, and some without any collateral, and all kinds of things that are sort of required to get the gears of finance working for regular people. And borrowers repaid at rates that the traditional bankers never thought were possible. So in the high 90s, Yunus trusted the people, and the people trust Yunus.
All right, well, that's a good place to leave it. This has been This Week in Impact. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you again, Brian.
And David, what's the best way for people to contact us with feedback?
It's always podcast@impactalpha.com. Please send us your thoughts.
Great. And thank you all for listening. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen and share this with a friend or colleague. If you want to help us out, be sure to rate us and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join other agents of impact by subscribing to Impact Alpha. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.